A dog was despised by a cruel family. They had several pets and did not value him, until one day they abandoned the poor dog on the road. The future would surprise everyone when a millionaire stumbled upon the dog. Before hearing this wonderful story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Before you hear this wonderful story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Atop a hill surrounded by a meticulously maintained vast garden stood the imposing Windcrest Manor. With its white marble walls and tall windows reflecting the setting sun, the property was a silent testament to the wealth and power of its sole occupant, Augustus Morgan. At 55, Augustus was considered one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the country. His business empire spanned from cutting-edge technology to major real estate developments. To the outside world, he was the epitome of success, a man who had conquered everything money could buy. On that autumn afternoon, Augustus observed the distant city through the window of his study. The sky was painted in shades of orange, creating a dramatic contrast with the skyscrapers rising on the horizon. His eyes, a deep blue marked by small wrinkles at the corners, did not reflect the beauty of the landscape. There was a melancholy in them that all his money couldn't erase. "Mr. Morgan," the voice of his personal assistant Claire interrupted his thoughts. "You have a video conference with the shareholders in 5 minutes." Augustus nodded without turning around. "Thank you, Claire. You can start preparing the documents for tomorrow's meeting." Claire hesitated for a moment before leaving. She had worked for Augustus for years, and although she maintained a strictly professional relationship, she couldn't help but notice the weight of loneliness that seemed to envelop her boss like a constant shadow. Alone again, Augustus adjusted his silk tie and sat down at his mahogany desk. The computer screen lit up, showing smiling and anxious faces. The shareholders, always eager for more profits, more expansion, more power. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Augustus began, his voice deep and controlled. "Let's analyze the numbers for the last quarter." The meeting stretched on for almost 2 hours. Graphs, projections, and strategies were discussed in detail. Augustus conducted everything with the precision of a maestro, his sharp mind dissecting each proposal, anticipating problems, proposing solutions. This was what he was good at. This was what he lived for. Or at least, that's what he tried to convince himself. When the last connection was closed, Augustus leaned back in his leather chair, exhausted. It wasn't physical fatigue, but a weariness that came from within, from the core of his being. He looked around the luxurious office, filled with extremely expensive works of art and exclusively designed furniture. Everything there screamed wealth and power, but whispered loneliness. The sound of his cell phone brought him back to reality. It was his sister, Bethany. "Augustus, darling. How are you?" Bethany's syrupy voice made Augustus frown. She only called him that when she wanted something. "I'm fine, Bethany. What's the matter?" "Oh, nothing much. I just wanted to remind you that little Henry's birthday is coming up. You know how children love presents from their rich uncle." Augustus sighed internally. "Of course, Bethany. I'll send something appropriate." "You're a dear." "Oh, and since we're on the subject of money, you know that new venture I mentioned? Well, I'm in need of a small initial investment." The conversation dragged on for a few more minutes, with Bethany elaborating on grandiose plans that Augustus knew would never get off the ground. When he finally hung up, he felt even emptier. It was always like this. Family, friends, acquaintances, they all seemed to orbit around him, attracted not by who he was but by what he possessed. Augustus couldn't help but wonder if anyone really cared about him, beyond his wealth. Tired, he decided to call it a night. He left the office and walked through the long corridors of the mansion, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls were adorned with valuable paintings and photographs of Augustus with celebrities and world leaders. Forced smiles, rehearsed handshakes. Everything seemed so empty now. Upon reaching his bedroom, Augustus stopped in front of the mirror. The man staring back at him seemed like a stranger. Perfectly combed grey hair, impeccable suit, upright posture. The image of success. But the eyes. The eyes told a different story. He lay down on his king-size bed, feeling the weight of silence around him. The mansion was too big for one man alone. Sometimes he imagined what it would be like to have someone to share all of this with. Not out of interest, but out of genuine affection. His thoughts wandered to his youth, to the dreams he had before the pursuit of success consumed everything. He remembered how passionate he used to be about music, how he loved playing guitar in circles of friends. When was the last time he had played? He couldn't even remember anymore. Sleep was slow to come, and when it finally did, it was restless and populated by confusing dreams. Augustus saw himself running through a maze of mirrors, chasing a figure he couldn't reach. At every turn he saw only reflections of himself, each time older and lonelier. He woke up startled by the sound of the alarm clock. Another day was beginning, identical to the previous ones. He got up mechanically, prepared himself for another journey of meetings, negotiations, and decisions that would affect millions. As he ate his breakfast, prepared with precision by his staff and served in the immense dining room where he sat alone, Augustus contemplated the day's agenda. Nothing there truly excited him. It was all a well-rehearsed routine, a role he had been playing for so long that he no longer knew who he was behind the mask of the successful magnate. "Sir," Claire appeared at the dining room door, "the car is ready to take you to the office." Augustus nodded, standing up. Before leaving, he paused for a moment in front of one of the enormous windows overlooking the garden. Outside, the world seemed alive, full of possibilities. Birds sang in the trees, the wind blew gently, carrying the scent of flowers. For a brief moment, Augustus felt a pang of envy for that freedom, that simplicity. But the moment passed and he composed himself. He adjusted his tie, straightened his shoulders, and walked towards the door. The business world awaited him, with its promises of more power, more wealth, more loneliness. As the luxury car glided through the gates of the mansion, Augustus couldn't imagine that his life was about to change drastically. Fate, in its infinite wisdom, had already set in motion the events that would transform his existence. And it would all begin with an unexpected encounter, an unlikely connection that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of wealth. But for now, as the driver maneuvered through the busy city streets, Augustus Morgan continued to be just another rich and lonely man, trapped in his golden cage, unaware that the key to his liberation was closer than he could imagine. Augustus Morgan's day followed its usual course, filled with endless meetings and corporate decisions that weighed on his shoulders. At the end of the afternoon, exhausted and with an overloaded mind, he decided to do something unusual, walk home, dismissing his driver. "Are you sure, sir?" asked the chauffeur, visibly surprised. "I am, John. I need to stretch my legs a bit. I'll see you tomorrow." As he walked through the busy downtown streets, Augustus felt strangely anonymous. Without his luxury car or his usual entourage, he was just another passerby in the crowd. There was something liberating about this feeling. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. Augustus decided to take a shortcut through a nearby park. The contrast between the city's concrete and the green of the trees was invigorating. He took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs. That's when he heard it. A low whimper, almost imperceptible amidst the park's buzz. Augustus stopped, looking around. The sound came again, this time clearer. It was coming from behind a nearby bush. Driven by a curiosity he hadn't felt in a long time, Augustus approached. There, huddled and trembling, was a dog. It was a medium-sized mutt, with mottled brown fur and large expressive eyes. The animal looked scared and hungry. Augustus was paralyzed for a moment, not knowing how to react. He had never had much contact with animals, let alone a stray dog. His first inclination was to back away, return to his walk and leave the problem for someone else. But something in the dog's eyes held him back. There was a mixture of fear and hope that touched Augustus in a way he didn't expect. Slowly he crouched down, extending his hand towards the animal. "Hey, boy. It's okay, I won't hurt you," said Augustus, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. The dog hesitated for a moment, but then, as if understanding that Augustus posed no threat, cautiously approached. Its nose lightly touched the outstretched hand, and Augustus felt a wave of emotion he hadn't experienced in years. "You're hungry, aren't you?" Augustus rummaged through his pockets, finding a packet of crackers he had picked up earlier at the office. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. The dog ate the crackers eagerly, looking at Augustus with what seemed to be gratitude. When it finished, to Augustus's surprise, the animal moved closer, leaning against his leg. Augustus felt something melt inside him. Without thinking too much, he began to pet the dog's fur, noticing the various scars and marks that told a silent story of suffering. "What happened to you, friend?" muttered Augustus, more to himself than to the dog. The sun had completely set, and the park lights were starting to come on. Augustus knew he needed to leave, but the idea of leaving the dog there, alone and unprotected, deeply bothered him. "I can't just leave you here," he said, surprising himself with his own words. With a decision that would change his life forever, Augustus picked up the dog in his arms. The animal, as if understanding it was being rescued, offered no resistance. "Let's go home, boy. We'll figure out what to do tomorrow." The journey back to the mansion was surreal. Augustus, always so controlled and concerned with appearances, was now walking through the streets carrying a dirty and mistreated stray dog. People looked, some with curiosity, others with disapproval. But for the first time in a long time, Augustus didn't care what others thought. Upon reaching the gates of the mansion, the night security guard, Mr. Oldman, almost fell over in surprise. "Mr. Morgan, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Oldman. Just brought a guest to spend the night." Inside the mansion, the reaction was no different. The housekeeper, Mrs. Cecilia, an austere lady who had worked for Augustus for decades, was slack-jawed when she saw her employer enter with the dog in his arms. "Good heavens! What is that, Mr. Augustus?" "This, Cecilia, is a dog," replied Augustus, with a tone of amusement that surprised even himself. "And he's going to need a bath and something to eat. Can you arrange that, please?" Still bewildered, Mrs. Cecilia nodded and hurried off to carry out the orders. Augustus took the dog to one of the many rooms in the mansion, gently placing it on an expensive Persian rug. "Well, I guess we need to give you a name," said Augustus, observing the animal that was now looking around curiously. "How about Max?" The dog tilted its head, as if considering the name, and then wagged its tail. "Max it is, then," laughed Augustus. That night, for the first time in years, Windcrest Manor came to life. There was movement, noise, a different energy in the air. Augustus personally supervised Max's bath, laughing when the dog shook itself and soaked everyone around. Later, in the kitchen, Augustus surprised the private chef by asking him to prepare a special meal for Max. "Something nutritious, suitable for a dog that needs to regain its health," he instructed. As Max ate heartily, Augustus watched him, feeling a strange mix of emotions. There was concern, of course. What would he do with a dog? He knew nothing about caring for animals. But there was also a sense of purpose, joy. It was hard to define. Later, when all the staff had retired, Augustus took Max to his bedroom. He improvised a bed with soft pillows and blankets, placing it next to his own king-size bed. "I hope you're comfortable there, friend," said Augustus, lying down. To his surprise, Max got up from his improvised bed and jumped onto Augustus's bed, snuggling up next to him. For a moment, Augustus thought about sending the dog back to the floor, but then, looking into those trusting eyes, he relented. "Just for tonight, okay?" That night, Augustus slept better than he had in years. There were no nightmares, no usual insomnia. Just a deep, restful sleep lulled by Max's rhythmic breathing beside him. When the sun rose, bringing a new day, Augustus woke up feeling different. There was a lightness in his chest, a sense that something important had changed. Max was still sleeping peacefully beside him. Augustus observed him for a moment, an involuntary smile forming on his lips. He knew he had important decisions to make. What would he do with Max? How would he care for him? Would his busy life allow for the presence of a pet? But for the first time in a long time, Augustus didn't feel overwhelmed by these decisions. On the contrary, he felt energized, even eager, to face these new challenges. Carefully, so as not to wake Max, Augustus got up and went to the window. The sun was rising over the city, bathing everything in a golden, promising light. Looking at that familiar view, Augustus felt as if he was seeing it for the first time. "Well, Max," he said softly, looking at the dog who was beginning to stretch on the bed, "I think our lives have just changed." And with those words, Augustus Morgan took the first step on a journey that would lead him to rediscover the meaning of love, loyalty, and true wealth. A journey that began with a simple act of kindness in a city park, and that would continue to unfold in ways he could never have imagined. The days that followed Max's arrival were a roller coaster of emotions and discoveries for Augustus Morgan. The meticulously constructed routine of years, was completely altered by the presence of the new canine companion. On the very first morning, Augustus found himself facing a dilemma he had never imagined: how to reconcile his business responsibilities with the care that Max needed. "Claire," he called over the intercom, "I need you to cancel my commitments for this morning." On the other end of the line, there was a moment of stunned silence. "Cancel, sir." "But the meeting with the Chinese investors? Reschedule for next week. An urgent personal matter has come up." Hanging up the intercom, Augustus looked at Max, who was watching him with expectant eyes. "Well, buddy, I think we need to do some shopping." The trip to the pet store was a surreal experience for Augustus. Accustomed to corporate environments and luxury stores, he found himself lost among shelves of colorful toys, different types of food, and pet accessories. "Can I help you, sir?" asked a young attendant, noticing his confused expression. "Ah, yes. I adopted a dog, Max, and I need everything, I guess." The attendant smiled, understanding. "First time as a pet owner? Don't worry, we'll put together a complete kit for Max." 2 hours later, Augustus left the store with his car full of bags. There were collars, leashes, beds, toys, premium food, treats, special shampoos, and even a small toothbrush for dogs. Back at the mansion, Max greeted Augustus with enthusiasm, wagging his tail frantically. "Look what I brought for you, boy," said Augustus, surprising himself with his own excited tone. As he unpacked the purchases, Augustus found himself smiling. There was something comforting about caring for another living being, about worrying about someone else's needs besides his own. The following days were ones of adaptation for both. Augustus learned, not without some difficulties, to establish a routine for Max. Morning walks through the mansion's garden became an essential part of his morning, often delaying his arrival at the office. "Mr. Morgan, you seem different," Claire commented one morning, noticing the dog hair on Augustus's impeccable suit. He smiled, something he had been doing more frequently lately. "Different how, Claire?" "I'm not sure, and more relaxed maybe? More happy?" Augustus reflected on this as he reviewed some contracts. It was true, he did feel different. Max's presence had brought a new perspective to his life. The lonely nights had been replaced by sessions of play and affection. The mornings, once filled only with financial news, now included invigorating walks. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Max, still adapting to his new life, occasionally had accidents around the house, much to Mrs. Cecilia's dismay. "Mr. Augustus, that rug was a relic," she lamented after a particularly disastrous incident. "Don't worry, Cecilia, rugs can be replaced," Augustus responded to everyone's surprise. The old Augustus would have been furious at such carelessness. As the days passed, Augustus began to notice subtle changes in himself. His business decisions, once cold and calculating, now seemed to take into account a human factor he hadn't considered before. In a particularly tense meeting about staff cuts, Augustus surprised everyone by proposing alternatives that would preserve jobs. "But this will affect our short-term profits," argued one of the directors. "Sometimes the value of a company isn't measured just by the numbers on a spreadsheet," Augustus replied, thinking about how Max's loyalty and affection were priceless. At home, the relationship between Augustus and Max deepened. The businessman found himself talking to the dog, sharing his thoughts and concerns in a way he had never done with anyone. "You know, Max," he said one night, as they both relaxed on the porch, "I think you're teaching me more than I could have imagined." Max tilted his head as if he understood, and rested his muzzle on Augustus's lap. However, not everyone viewed this change in Augustus positively. His sister, Bethany, was shocked when she visited the mansion and found Max comfortably installed in the living room. "My God, Augustus, what's gotten into you? A mutt in this house." "Max isn't a mutt, Bethany, he's my friend," Augustus replied, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. Bethany laughed, incredulous. "Friend? Augustus, are you going senile? It's just a dog." Bethany's words hurt Augustus more than he would have liked to admit. They made him question. Was he really changing? Or was he just projecting emotions onto an animal? That night, as Max slept peacefully at the foot of his bed, Augustus lay awake, thoughtful. He reflected on the past few weeks, on how his life had transformed since Max's arrival. He remembered how he used to be before, cold, calculating, always putting business first. Now he found himself considering the impact of his decisions on people's lives. He smiled more, cared more. "Is this madness?" he whispered to himself. As if answering his question, Max got up sleepily and approached, laying his head on Augustus's lap. The simple and affectionate gesture brought tears to the businessman's eyes. No, it wasn't madness. It was growth. It was learning to see the world from a new perspective, through the loyal and loving eyes of a being who didn't care about his bank account or social status. At that moment, Augustus made a decision. He wouldn't allow the opinions of others, not even his family, to diminish what he was building with Max. This new version of himself, more compassionate and open, was something he wanted to explore and develop. "Thank you, friend," murmured Augustus, caressing Max's ears. "I think you're saving me." The following days brought new challenges and discoveries. Augustus began researching about dog care, fascinated by a world that was previously completely foreign to him. He hired a trainer to help with Max's education, but insisted on actively participating in the process. At the office, his employees noticed the change. The once feared boss now seemed more accessible, more human. There were those who questioned whether this would make him a weaker leader, but it soon became clear that Augustus's new approach was actually improving the work environment and productivity. One afternoon, while walking with Max in the park where he had found him, Augustus had an idea. He observed other dog owners, the interactions between the animals, the simple joy that emanated from those relationships. "What if we could help more dogs like you, Max?" he asked, an idea beginning to form in his mind. That night, Augustus stayed up late in his home office, researching animal shelters, adoption programs, and animal protection laws. A new passion was being born, one that combined his business know-how with this new compassionate side that Max had awakened. When he finally went to bed, Augustus felt an excitement he hadn't experienced in years. He had a new purpose, a new direction for his life and his resources. "Tomorrow will be a new day, Max," he said as the dog snuggled up next to him. "And I think we have a lot of work ahead of us." With these thoughts, Augustus fell asleep, dreaming of possibilities that, just a few weeks before, he would never have considered. The transformation initiated by a casual encounter in a park continued, promising to take both Augustus and Max on unexpected and rewarding paths. The sun had barely risen when Augustus woke up, a renewed energy pulsing through his veins. Max, sensing his owner's agitation, raised his head, looking at him with curiosity. "Today is a big day, buddy," said Augustus, scratching Max's ears. "We're going to start something new." After a longer than usual morning walk, Augustus headed to the office with a determination that surprised even his faithful assistant, Claire. "Claire, I need you to cancel my commitments for the next 2 weeks," he announced as soon as he entered. "2 weeks?" Claire repeated, astonished. "But sir, the merger with the German company—" "Can wait," interrupted Augustus, a different gleam in his eyes. "We have something more important to do." In the hours that followed, Augustus immersed himself in a whirlwind of research and planning. He summoned a team of his best employees, including lawyers, accountants, and marketing specialists. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, facing the hastily assembled group, "we are about to embark on a new project, one that I believe will change not just our company, but also the lives of many." With unusual passion, Augustus outlined his vision: a foundation dedicated to rescuing and rehabilitating abandoned animals, with a special focus on dogs. The project would not just be a charity initiative, but a complete enterprise, including low-cost veterinary clinics, education programs about responsible pet ownership, and even a line of pet products whose income would revert to the cause. "But sir," intervened one of the lawyers, "this is completely different from anything we've ever done. We have no experience in this sector." Augustus smiled, remembering how inexperienced he himself had been when Max entered his life. "That's true, but we have resources, intelligence, and now motivation. The rest we'll learn along the way." The news of Augustus Morgan's new venture spread quickly. Journalists started calling, curious about this drastic change of direction from one of the country's biggest businessmen. Amidst all this agitation, Augustus didn't forget the catalyst for all of this. Every night, no matter how exhausted he was, he reserved time for Max. Long walks, play sessions, and quiet moments of companionship became his refuge amid the frenzy of launching a new enterprise. A week after the initial announcement, Augustus decided to personally visit one of the city's largest animal shelters. What he saw broke his heart. Hundreds of dogs and cats, many in precarious conditions, all yearning for a home. "How do you deal with all this?" he asked the shelter coordinator, a middle-aged woman named Martha, whose eyes carried the weight of countless sad stories. "We do what we can with the little we have," she replied, tired but determined. "Every animal rescued, every successful adoption is a victory." That visit solidified Augustus's conviction. On the way back home, he made several calls, accelerating the process of creating the foundation. "I want us to be operational in a month," he instructed his team. While Augustus dedicated himself body and soul to the new project, not everyone around him understood or supported his sudden change. His sister, Bethany, showed up at the mansion one night, visibly disturbed. "Augustus, have you lost your mind?" she demanded to know. "Abandoning lucrative businesses to play savior of street dogs?" "I'm not abandoning anything, Bethany," Augustus calmly replied, while Max watched the scene attentively. "I'm expanding, creating something meaningful." "Meaningful?" Bethany laughed humorlessly. "What about the family legacy? The fortune our parents built?" Augustus looked at Max, who approached and nudged his hand with his nose, as if offering support. "The true legacy, Bethany, is the positive impact we leave on the world, and that's what I intend to do." The discussion dragged on, with Bethany alternating between pleas and veiled threats. When she finally left, Augustus felt exhausted, but more determined than ever. "It's not going to be easy, is it, Max?" he murmured, sinking into his favorite armchair. The dog jumped onto his lap, something that would have been unthinkable a few weeks ago, and Augustus found himself smiling despite the stress. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activities. Augustus dove headfirst into creating the foundation, actively participating in every aspect. He visited more shelters, talked to veterinarians and animal behavior specialists, and even spent an entire day accompanying a rescue team. Amidst all this, he noticed a change in himself. The man who once cared only about profits and acquisitions now found himself moved by stories of successful rescues. His heart ached at seeing mistreated animals and filled with joy at witnessing adoptions. One afternoon, while reviewing plans for the Foundation's first veterinary clinic, Augustus received an unexpected call. "Mr. Morgan," said a female voice on the other end of the line, "this is Martha from the shelter you visited." "Hello, Martha. Is there a problem?" "Actually, we have a delicate situation. We received a dog in critical condition. He needs urgent surgery, but we don't have the resources." Before she could finish, Augustus was already on his feet. "Give me the address of the clinic. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Hours later, Augustus found himself in a veterinary clinic waiting room, anxious for news. The dog, an elderly Labrador named Duke, had been abandoned and was in terrible condition. When the veterinarian finally came out of the operating room, the smile on his face said it all. "He's going to recover," he announced. At that moment, seeing the relief on Martha's face and those of the shelter volunteers, Augustus knew he was on the right path. This, saving lives, making a difference, was what gave meaning to his existence now. Back at the mansion late at night, Augustus sat with Max in the garden, contemplating the stars. "You know, Max," he said, his voice soft in the quiet night, "I think I've finally understood what it means to be truly rich. It has nothing to do with money in the bank." Max rested his head on Augustus's knee, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. In that moment of peace, Augustus felt immense gratitude for the path life had presented to him. The next day, the Hearts and Paws Foundation would be officially launched. There was much work ahead, challenges to overcome, and hearts to win. But Augustus Morgan, the man who was once known only for his fortune, was ready to face it all. With Max by his side and a new purpose in his heart, he knew that each day would bring not only new challenges, but also new opportunities to do good and become a better person. And so, under the starry sky, man and dog rested, ready for the next chapter of their intertwined lives, a chapter full of hope, compassion, and unconditional love. The official launch of the Hearts and Paws Foundation attracted more attention than Augustus had anticipated. The local press showed up in force, curious to understand the sudden change of focus of the famous businessman. Cameras, flashes, and microphones surrounded Augustus as he, with Max faithfully by his side, cut the inaugural ribbon of the Foundation's first veterinary clinic. "Mr. Morgan, what motivated this drastic change in your career?" asked a reporter, pushing a microphone in his direction. Augustus looked at Max, who was calmly wagging his tail beside him, oblivious to the commotion. "Sometimes," he replied with a smile, "we need a four-legged friend to show us what really matters in life." The weeks that followed were intense. Augustus divided his time between managing his traditional businesses and driving the new foundation. Nights were often spent poring over reports and spreadsheets, with Max sleeping at his feet. However, not everything ran as smoothly as Augustus had hoped. The veterinary clinic was always packed, which was good, but it also revealed the enormous demand for accessible animal care. The shelter associated with the foundation quickly reached its maximum capacity, forcing Augustus to look for more space and resources. One particularly stressful afternoon, as Augustus wrestled with logistical problems, he received an unexpected visit to his office. It was Claire, his assistant, looking nervous. "Mr. Morgan, there's something I need to show you," she said, extending a folder. Intrigued, Augustus opened the file. As he read, his face grew paler. It was a detailed report about an animal trafficking network operating in the city, involving influential people, including some of his own business associates. "Claire, how did you get this information?" Claire took a deep breath. "I have a brother who works in the police. He's been investigating this case for months, but there's a lot of pressure to cover it all up." Augustus felt a mixture of anger and determination growing inside him. "This can't continue," he declared, his voice firm. In the days that followed, Augustus immersed himself in his own investigation, using his contacts and resources to unearth more information about the trafficking network. What he discovered horrified him. Animals being bred in deplorable conditions, sold as merchandise and often abandoned when they were no longer useful. One night, while working late in his home office, Augustus heard a strange noise coming from the garden. Max, who had been sleeping at his feet, suddenly got up, his ears alert. "What is it, boy?" muttered Augustus, getting up to investigate. Upon opening the back door, Augustus was shocked by what he saw. There, trembling and clearly injured, was a puppy. Its paws were tied, and there were evident marks of mistreatment on its small body. Without hesitation, Augustus picked up the puppy in his arms and brought it inside. Max followed them, sniffing the newcomer with curiosity and concern. "My God, who would do such a thing?" Augustus murmured, carefully examining the puppy. It was then that he noticed something attached to the animal's makeshift collar, a piece of paper with a scrawled message. "Stop investigating, or the next one will be yours." A chill ran down Augustus's spine. His investigation into animal trafficking had not gone unnoticed, and now he was receiving direct threats. That night, as he cared for the rescued puppy and watched Max sleeping peacefully, Augustus reflected on the path he had chosen. He knew he was messing with powerful interests, that he was putting himself at risk. But looking at the two dogs, one that had changed his life and another he had just saved, he knew he couldn't back down. The next morning, Augustus called an emergency meeting with his foundation team and some of his most trusted lawyers. "The situation is more serious than we imagined," he began, his voice laden with determination. "But we won't back down. We're going to intensify our efforts." In the days that followed, Augustus worked tirelessly. He increased security around the mansion and the foundation, but refused to diminish his activities. On the contrary, he expanded the reach of Hearts and Paws, launching an awareness campaign about animal trafficking and pushing for stricter laws. The rescued puppy, which Augustus named Brave, became a symbol of the Foundation's fight. His story, carefully disseminated by the media, touched hearts and brought even more support to the cause. However, the threats continued. Augustus received anonymous phone calls, intimidating emails, and even attempts to sabotage the Foundation's work. But each obstacle only strengthened his resolution. One night, while walking with Max and Brave in the mansion's garden, Augustus had an epiphany. He realized that his life had gained a purpose that went far beyond accumulating wealth or power. He was fighting for something greater than himself, something that could make a real difference in the world. "You two changed my life," he said to the dogs, who looked at him with adoration. "And now together, we're going to change the lives of many others." That night, Augustus made a promise to himself and his faithful canine companions. He would not rest until he dismantled the animal trafficking network and ensured that Hearts and Paws became an unstoppable force in the protection and care of animals. With this renewed determination, Augustus prepared to face the challenges that would come. He knew the path would be difficult, that there would be obstacles and dangers. But with Max and Brave by his side, and with the strength of his conviction, he was ready for any battle. The man who once cared only about profits and power was now on the front lines of a fight for compassion and justice. And despite the risks, Augustus Morgan had never felt more alive or more fulfilled. As the night progressed, Augustus, Max, and Brave returned to the mansion, united not just by bonds of affection, but by a common purpose. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The journey that began with a chance encounter in a park was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity for Augustus and the Hearts and Paws Foundation. Each day, new challenges arose, but new victories were also won. The Foundation's veterinary clinic now attended to hundreds of animals per week, and the shelter had expanded to a larger property on the outskirts of the city. Augustus spent his days divided between strategic meetings, visits to the Foundation's projects, and of course precious moments with Max and Brave. The rescued puppy had fully recovered and was now a healthy young dog, inseparable from his older canine protector. One morning, while having breakfast on the veranda with his two furry companions, Augustus received a call from Martha, the shelter coordinator. "Mr. Morgan, we have a situation," she said, her voice tense. "The police made a huge seizure of animals from an illegal breeding facility. They're asking for our help to shelter and care for them." Augustus felt his heart tighten. "How many animals, Martha?" "Over 100, sir. Dogs, cats, even some exotic animals, most of them in terrible conditions." Without hesitation, Augustus mobilized the entire Foundation team. Within hours, a large-scale rescue operation was underway. Tents were set up, veterinary teams were summoned, and volunteers from all over the city came forward to help. Arriving at the seizure site, Augustus was confronted with a scene that horrified him. Dozens of cages crammed with frightened and mistreated animals. The smell of fear and suffering was palpable. "How can anyone do this?" he muttered, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. Working tirelessly, the Hearts and Paws team began rescuing the animals one by one. Each creature received immediate medical care, food, and for the first time in a long time, a gentle touch. While supervising the operation, Augustus noticed a police officer observing everything with a thoughtful look. Approaching him, he introduced himself. "Thank you for the work you're doing," said the officer, identifying himself as Sergeant Rodriguez. "But I'm afraid this is just the tip of the iceberg." Intrigued, Augustus asked for more details. Sergeant Rodriguez looked around, making sure no one else was listening, and lowered his voice. "Mr. Morgan, this breeding facility is part of a much larger network. We have information that powerful people are involved. People who don't like having their business interrupted, if you know what I mean." Augustus felt a chill run down his spine, remembering the threats he had received. "Sergeant, what else can you tell me about this?" The officer hesitated. "Officially, nothing, but let's say if someone wanted to investigate further, I'd suggest they look into the international port. There are rumors about containers arriving in the middle of the night, if you catch my drift." Before Augustus could ask more questions, they were interrupted by one of the Foundation's veterinarians. "Mr. Morgan, we need your decision. We have some critical cases that need expensive surgeries. Our current structure can't handle—" "Do whatever is necessary," Augustus interrupted. "Mobilize the best specialists. Don't worry about costs. We're going to save everyone we can." In the days that followed, Augustus barely slept. He coordinated the rescue efforts, dealt with the press that now surrounded the Foundation seeking statements, and still tried to digest the information that Sergeant Rodriguez had shared. One night, exhausted, he found himself alone in his home office. Max and Brave slept at his feet, offering silent comfort. Looking at a framed photo of himself with the two dogs, Augustus felt the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. It was then that he heard a noise coming from the garden. Alert, he stood up, with Max and Brave immediately awake and attentive. Cautiously, Augustus approached the window. In the dark, he saw a hooded figure moving furtively among the trees. His heart raced. The threats he had received came back to his mind with full force. Without thinking twice, Augustus activated the security system and called the police. Minutes later, which seemed like an eternity, sirens could be heard approaching. The mysterious figure fled, leaving behind only an envelope attached to the trunk of a tree. When the police finally cleared the area, Augustus, with trembling hands, opened the envelope. Inside was just a photo. In it, Augustus could see himself, Max, and Brave during one of their morning walks. The image was marked with a red X. On the back, a sinister message: "Last chance. Back off or lose everything." That night, as the police scoured the property for clues, Augustus sat in the living room. Max and Brave pressed against him, offering silent comfort. He knew he had reached a critical point. The threat was now real and tangible. For a brief moment, Augustus considered backing down. After all, he had a comfortable life before all this. He could simply return to his business, let others fight this battle. But then he looked at Max, the dog that had changed his life, and at Brave, the puppy he had saved. He thought of all the animals that had been rescued that day, and how many more still needed help. At that moment, Augustus Morgan made his decision. He would not back down. He would not abandon the fight. On the contrary, he would intensify his efforts. "You two taught me what true courage is," he said to the dogs, his voice firm despite the fear he felt. "It's time to put that lesson into practice." With renewed determination, Augustus began to plan his next move. He knew the days ahead would be dangerous, that he would be challenging powerful and unscrupulous people, but he also knew he wasn't alone. As the night progressed, Augustus, Max, and Brave remained together, united against the approaching storm. The man who once only cared about profits was now ready to risk everything for a cause greater than himself. The real battle was just beginning, and Augustus Morgan was determined to fight to the end, no matter the cost. The days following the threat in the garden were tense and filled with frantic activity. Augustus, determined not to back down in the face of danger, intensified his efforts on all fronts. His first action was to reinforce security, not just at his mansion, but also at all Hearts and Paws Foundation facilities. State-of-the-art cameras were installed, guards were hired, and rigorous security protocols were implemented. At the same time, Augustus decided it was time to take the fight to the public sphere. He called a press conference where, with Max and Brave by his side, he made a bombshell announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here today to denounce a criminal network of animal trafficking operating in our city. I have evidence that influential people are involved, and I won't rest until all those responsible are brought to justice." Augustus's statement fell like a bomb in the media. Within hours, his story was in every newspaper and newscast. Some called him a courageous hero, others a reckless madman. While the city buzzed with the revelations, Augustus continued his private investigation. Sergeant Rodriguez's words about the international port wouldn't leave his mind. Determined to uncover the truth, he hired a team of private investigators to monitor nighttime activities at the port. A week after the press conference, Augustus received a call in the middle of the night. "Mr. Morgan," said the tense voice of the lead investigator, "I think we've found something. A suspicious container is being unloaded right now." Without hesitation, Augustus jumped out of bed, waking Max and Brave in the process. "I'm on my way," he said, already putting on a coat. "Sir, I don't think it's safe," the investigator began, but Augustus had already hung up. Minutes later, Augustus was in his car, driving towards the port. Max and Brave, sensing their owner's tension, were restless in the back seat. Upon arriving in the vicinity of the port, Augustus parked on a dark side street and continued on foot, with the dogs by his side. From afar, he could see lights and movement near one of the warehouses. Approaching cautiously, hidden in the shadows, Augustus saw something that made his blood run cold. A container was being opened, and from inside came unmistakable sounds of distressed animals. But what really shocked him was seeing who was supervising the operation. There, giving orders to the workers, was a figure Augustus knew very well, his own brother-in-law, Richard, Bethany's husband. Augustus felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under his feet. Richard, the man who frequented his house, who played with his nephews, was involved in this criminal network? Before he could fully process what he was seeing, Augustus heard a low growl. Brave had detected something. Turning quickly, he found himself face to face with two menacing-looking men. "Well, well," said one of them, a cruel smile forming on his lips. "Looks like we have an intruder." Everything happened very quickly after that. Max and Brave positioned themselves protectively in front of Augustus, growling at the men. There were shouts, the sound of people running, and then the deafening noise of police sirens approaching. In the chaos that followed, Augustus saw Richard trying to flee. Without thinking twice, he ran after his brother-in-law, with Max and Brave on his heels. "Richard!" shouted Augustus, reaching him and grabbing his arm. "How could you? How could you be involved in this?" Richard's face was a mask of fury and fear. "You don't understand, Augustus. There's more at stake here than you can imagine." Before Richard could say more, they were surrounded by police officers. Sergeant Rodriguez was among them, a look of determination on his face. "Mr. Morgan, please step back," he said, handcuffing Richard. "We have a lot to talk about." The following hours were a blur of statements, press declarations, and shocking revelations. The animal trafficking scheme was larger and more complex than anyone had imagined, involving politicians, businessmen, and even judicial figures. When Augustus finally returned home, the sun was already rising. Exhausted, but with a renewed sense of purpose, he sat on the porch, Max and Brave faithfully by his side. "You were very brave today," he told the dogs, petting their heads. "I don't know what would have happened if you weren't there." As he watched the sunrise, Augustus reflected on how his life had changed. From a businessman focused only on profits, he had become a tireless advocate for animals, willing to risk everything for this cause. The path ahead was still long and full of challenges. There would be court cases, more investigations, and undoubtedly, resistance from those who wanted to maintain the status quo. But Augustus knew he was no longer alone in this fight. Looking at Max, the dog that had started this whole journey, and at Brave, the symbol of all the animals that still needed to be saved, Augustus felt a wave of determination wash over him. "We still have a lot of work ahead of us, my friends," he said, his voice full of emotion. "But together we're going to make a difference. We're going to build a world where all animals are treated with the love and respect they deserve." And so, as a new day began, Augustus Morgan, Max, and Brave prepared for the next chapter of their journey. A journey of courage, compassion, and unconditional love, which had transformed not only their lives but the lives of countless animals and people around them. The battle was far from over, but with each new dawn, the hope for a better future for all living beings grew stronger. 5 years passed since that fateful night at the port. 5 years of intense struggles, immeasurable challenges, but also inspiring victories and profound changes. Augustus Morgan, now 60 years old, walked across the well-manicured lawns of what was once his lonely mansion. Today, the place was the beating heart of the Hearts and Paws Foundation, a complex that housed a state-of-the-art veterinary clinic, a rehabilitation center for rescued animals, and a research institute dedicated to animal welfare. By his side, as always, were Max and Brave. Max, now an elderly dog, moved more slowly, but his eyes still shone with the same loyalty and love. Brave, in his prime, was the image of strength and courage that his name suggested. "Look at this, my friends," said Augustus, stopping to observe the movement in the central courtyard. Volunteers came and went, taking dogs for walks, feeding rescued cats, and offering affection to animals that not long ago didn't know the gentle touch of a human hand. The path to get here hadn't been easy. The revelations about the animal trafficking network had shaken society. Richard's trial and that of his accomplices dragged on for years, exposing layer upon layer of corruption and cruelty. Augustus testified countless times, facing threats and attempts at defamation. There were moments when the weight seemed unbearable, nights when fear and doubt threatened to consume him. But in each of these moments, Max and Brave were there, offering silent comfort and reminding him of why he fought. Augustus's transformation didn't go unnoticed. From ruthless tycoon to tireless animal advocate, his journey inspired thousands. Donations began to pour in from all corners of the country, allowing Hearts and Paws to expand its operations beyond what Augustus had ever imagined. But perhaps the most profound change occurred in Augustus himself. The man who once measured success only in figures now found joy in small daily victories. A rescued animal, an adoptive home found, a protection law passed. As he walked through the complex, Augustus was approached by a young veterinarian, Dr. Lucy. one of the many talented professionals attracted by the Foundation's reputation. "Mr. Morgan," she called, a smile lighting up her face, "we have great news. Lola, that dog we rescued from the clandestine laboratory last month, is finally responding to treatment. She took her first steps today." Augustus felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He remembered Lola well, a beagle who had spent years being used in cruel experiments. When she was rescued, she could barely move, terrified of any human contact. "That's wonderful, Dr. Lucy. Can I see her?" Minutes later, Augustus was in the rehabilitation center, watching with teary eyes as Lola, hesitant but determined, took shaky steps towards a toy. Beside him, Max and Brave watched quietly, as if understanding the importance of the moment. "See, my friends," Augustus whispered to the dogs, "this is why we do what we do." That night, back in his office, now much more modest than the old one, as most of the mansion had been converted for the Foundation's use, Augustus reflected on his journey. His gaze fell on a framed photograph. Himself, much younger and more serious, in an expensive suit posing in front of one of his skyscrapers. Next to it, a recent photo, Augustus smiling, surrounded by rescued dogs and cats, Max and Brave proudly by his side. The contrast couldn't be greater, and yet Augustus knew he had never been as rich as he was now. Rich in purpose, in compassion, in love. A soft bark pulled him from his thoughts. Max and Brave were at the door, looking at him expectantly. It was time for the evening walk, a tradition they had maintained for years. Under the starry sky, walking through the Foundation's gardens, Augustus felt a deep peace. The air was full of the night sounds of animals, no longer trapped in cages, but free and safe. "You know," he said to the dogs, "when I found you, Max, in that park years ago, I thought I was saving an abandoned dog. Little did I know that in reality, you were saving me." Max looked up, his wise eyes meeting Augustus's. Brave, always alert, quickened his pace as if wanting to protect their small family group. Augustus smiled, feeling immense gratitude. "You two taught me the true meaning of loyalty, of unconditional love. You showed me that there are things much more valuable than money or power." Reaching a favorite bench, Augustus sat down, the dogs settling at his feet. Looking up at the sky, he thought about all the challenges that still awaited them. There was so much to be done, so many animals still needing help, so many minds to be changed. But there, in that moment of quietude, with his faithful companions by his side, Augustus Morgan knew he was exactly where he should be, doing exactly what he should be doing. "The future is bright, my friends," he said softly. "And together we'll continue to make a difference, one animal at a time." Max and Brave, as if understanding every word, rested their heads on Augustus's legs. And so, under the starry canopy of the night, man and dogs rested, united by a bond stronger than blood, more enduring than any material wealth. The journey that had begun with a chance encounter in a park had transformed into a life mission. And although the road ahead was still long, Augustus knew that, with Max and Brave by his side, there was no challenge too great to overcome. The man who was once known only for his fortune was now recognized for his heart, and that, Augustus knew, was the greatest wealth of all.